Welcome to the American Citizens Abroad podcast. I'm Michelle, and today I'm chatting with Matt and Liuan from the blog Slow Camino. Welcome. Thanks for chatting with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yeah. Your family took a gap year to slow travel. Where did you go?
Mostly we're in South America. We basically did a big V. So we started in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and made our way all the way to the southern tip of the continent in Ushuaia, Argentina, and then made our way back up the Pacific coast through Patagonia, Chile, Bolivia. We went to Colombia, Ecuador. We had to skip over Peru because we were having a political crisis at the time, unfortunately. And our last country was Costa Rica.
And have you lived in any other countries before this gap year, or was this your first time going overseas?
Neither of us had ever spent a year outside of the country, but I had spent a semester in Mexico doing an internship.
And I was born in China, so I moved to the US when I was 3 and spent a semester in China. And we've both taken extended periods of travel between 3 to 4 to 5 weeks in other countries.
Are there any gems you found while you were traveling that one wouldn't find on a tourist travel blog, in a book, or other tourist travel review sites? And if so, what and where were they?
There were a lot of gems, really, but I'll mention one. It was actually the first place we stayed, and we stayed there for a month. It was called Teresópolis, and it was about an hour or two outside of Rio de Janeiro. And I found it just like I find all our gems, which is I got on Google Earth and just started clicking around, looking for general beauty, something outside the city because we're more country people and we're more into hiking and stuff like that than stuff you do in the cities. And oh man, this place just had more places to go than we could possibly cover in a month. It had beautiful mountains, rock formations, national parks, and then even outside the national parks, the landscape itself was beautiful, rolling hills and farms and little waterfalls with no name that you could just spend a whole day at picnicking.
Well, now it's on a travel blog because we talked about it on our travel blog.
Yeah, it's a bad habit.
Are there any other places you want to share, or do you want to keep them secret?
We didn't really have a sense of what Chile would be like, other than we know that Patagonia is really popular. But we ended up staying at a farm in south central Chile, a little bit north of Patagonia, like in between Patagonia and Santiago. And that ended up being super interesting. We stayed for a couple weeks through a connection, friend of a friend type of thing. And when we first did a video chat with this person, she showed us her background, and it just looked like a wheat farm in the middle of the United States. And then you would see like driving through our part of the country, the Midwest. When we got there, we realized there's just so many other things going on. There's just chains of volcanoes all through that area. You can see that in addition to the wheat fields.
For some reason, they don't look that impressive in photographs, but when you're there, you see these volcanoes in the distance. It's surreal.
And because of all that volcanic activity from the past, there's a lot of interesting geological stuff going on, different kinds of rock formations and waterfalls. I guess we like waterfalls a lot.
You guys have 3 young boys. How did you manage traveling with them? The first thing that comes to mind, other than wrangling 3 boys on the daily, how did you manage homeschooling them while on the go?
Would have been much harder if we had left earlier. We waited until our youngest boy was at least around 4 years old. So we weren't lugging around diapers and baby paraphernalia. 3 little boys, the biggest challenges are they mess things up, they break things, and they do stupid, rowdy things and hurt themselves. That's pretty much the same whether you're at home or abroad. I would call that a wash. Homeschooling, I would call that difficult, but turned out fine. It was difficult for us because I think to really be successful at it, you have to have a pretty good set routine so they know what to expect and they can build off their skills and all that. And we tried doing that sometimes, but often we were toggling between really too relaxed about it and then realizing, wow, we haven't done school in 2 weeks. We should really hammer down. And the kids could see outside was really nice, and there was a pool out there, and there'd be tears, and it was difficult. But at the end of the time, they went back to public school and they're totally doing fine. In fact, above average. So I think the whole year they were soaking up things that didn't necessarily feel educational, but they were learning a lot.
And I would say that our approach to homeschooling was, we probably heard the term world schooling or unschooling. We did a fair amount of taking whatever was around us, whether that was the elections in Brazil, the presidential elections in the fall of 2022, or the Andes mountain range, or the volcanoes in Chile, and kind of using that as a basis for, okay, let's learn about this, and doing research and finding videos. We had a few resources that helped us. Obviously, we didn't want to take big boxes of workbooks with us on our trip. So it was pretty light, our materials, but we had our iPad and we had an app called Khan Academy that we used just to keep them doing things like basic reading and math practice on bus rides or wherever we could. And then another resource that I would mention is Dollar Street. It's this site, you might have heard of the book. What was the book called?
Factfulness
Factfulness.
by Hans Rosling.
Yeah, so the author of that book and some collaborators came up with this website that kind of shows you if you had $1, and maybe that's the United States, or I forget what the scale of it was, but basically all of the countries in the world follow along this street as far as their per capita income. And then you can really go into each country and visit a family and see videos of what their daily life looks like. And so we use that a fair amount, especially at the beginning of the trip, just to help our kids gain perspective on like what they were seeing in the countries that we were visiting and why they were different from our life back home and how they were or weren't different.
What were some other challenges that came up while slow traveling through South America?
Again, I would say the biggest challenge is homeschooling. That's probably has to do with personality, just the characteristics of the family. But for us, that was probably the most difficult. Another big thing, which would probably apply to everybody, is just travel planning, especially when you're moving around a lot and you're not just picking a place abroad. Travel planning becomes kind of a part-time job. In a way I didn't really expect when we left. I always kind of imagined it being, oh, we'll just kind of live by our whims, just go here if we feel like going here, or stop for a while if you really like this place. When you get to a country, oftentimes one of the requirements is that you already have to have a plan to leave that country. So right there, you kind of have to have some forethought as to where and when you're going.
We had hoped that our kids, they were enrolled in a dual language English Spanish school before we started our family sabbatical. During that year abroad, we were hoping they would get lots of immersion opportunities and chances to improve their Spanish. But because in our family we speak primarily English, I speak a little bit of Mandarin to the kids too, that getting those immersion opportunities and really encouraging them to practice Spanish with people that they didn't know or people that they were just meeting for hadn't had that much interaction with previously, that turned out to be more of a challenge than we expected.
Was it because most people spoke English to you?
I think it's because, well, me and Liuan actually speak pretty decent Spanish. And I think it's just that they could rely on us to make things happen in Spanish. There wasn't as much opportunity for them to independently have to interact. I think if we had kind of picked a place and put them in a school, they would have had to pick it up just to be able to survive and thrive.
There's a post on your blog about why midlife could be the best time to take a gap year. Could you talk about why this could be more beneficial than taking a gap year when one is younger?
So obviously, if you ever have the opportunity to take a year to travel, you should take it no matter what time of life it's in. I think it'll be wonderful. But I wrote that just from my experience having traveled when younger and having traveled now. I turned 40 while we were on our trip. And I think one thing I'll mention is our kid just out of college hasn't spent the last 15 to 20 years under fluorescent lights doing paperwork and computer work. I think there's just a level of appreciation for something new and a big change, especially if that life before was stressful. I could feel muscles relax that hadn't untensed probably for 15 years. I just think there was a much deeper level of appreciation for how good it was to take that time. And I really felt like I could really soak that in. Another thing is I just feel like midlife is a real good chance to kind of like shake things up and take a new track. Maybe it's a new job, or maybe it's just looking at your values and resetting them. But obviously, the biggest obstacle to that is fear of change, I think. Kind of imagine it being kind of this like survival thing deep in our brains that if you've done something for 15 years and you survived and didn't die, any kind of change might be catastrophic. I see taking a gap year kind of as a big exposure therapy. You kind of prove to yourself that I can make a change, I can live life on my own terms, and then come back and kind of have that fear out of the way when you're thinking about, well, how do I want to live the rest of my prime working years?
How did taking the gap year change you? And how about your kids?
When we got home, I didn't think really anything changed. In fact, we went back into our routines and it felt like our year abroad was just a big, weird dream, which was kind of a depressing thought. You know, you spent, I don't know, half a decade dreaming about doing this thing, and then we pulled it off, and it was really awesome. And then came back, and I couldn't point to anything really that had changed. We've been back for a year and a half, and there's actually like quite a few things that I can see over time have kind of revealed themselves. And I'll just mention one. Before we left, I was a very productive person. I would say I still am. The company I worked for one year, the motto was relentless pursuit of efficiency. And I was like, yeah, that's me.
Engineering company.
Yeah. What that meant is there was this bin in my mind of things that are just a waste of time. Whether or not I like doing them, if they don't improve my life at all, then they go in the waste of time bin and I won't even think of doing them. So I'll give you some examples of things I've gotten into since I've been back from our traveling. One is started doing puzzles. Big waste of time, but very enjoyable. And the kids like doing it, so it's a chance to do something fun with the kids. I actually started reading a lot more fiction, which I guess I used to think of as a waste of time because you're just reading about something fake, I suppose. Even though in reality, I think you can learn just as much from fiction as nonfiction. But again, I had this very sensitive view of what's purely productive and what's not. And I've started running again, started painting a lot, which is something I liked doing and did pretty well before, but maybe I do one painting every few years, and now I sit down weekly and do it. It's not even like I came to this realization and decided I'm going to change my values. Something deep down in my gut, I think, changed. This seed that was planted that made me realize that improving your life is about doing things you enjoy and give you life. And sometimes those things have no other value than you just enjoy them, and there's something that you do with the people you love.
Matt said nothing changed when we got back, but there was a significant change in that he had been working before we started traveling 5 days a week, so 9 to 5 job. And then when we got back during our travels, he continued to work, but as a contractor for the same employer 1 day a week. And coming back, we were able to work out an arrangement where he now works 3 days a week. So it's significantly less time than he used to work, which is amazing for our family. Having that abrupt disconnect for both of us from our career ladder, climbing up the career ladder and just making that decision that we weren't going to do that for a year, and realizing during our travels and when we got back that actually we're doing totally fine financially. We're healthier people on all levels, personally and emotionally and as a family. So I'm realizing that you don't have to do all the things and check all the boxes that people say you have to do career-wise. that has been a huge change as far as like how we approach life.
That's great. And have you noticed any difference with the kids?
I was thinking about that, and it's hard to say because I feel like kids change so much just naturally that it's really hard to say like what came from traveling and what's the fact that a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old are very different people. I think, I mean, they obviously know a whole lot more about the world than I would have at that age. They know about currency exchanges and they know way more of a foreign language. I knew none. They know the capital of Uruguay, and I wouldn't have even known what Uruguay was when I was a 7-year-old. So
Yeah, this is a funny example, and this goes back to when we were talking about homeschooling, world schooling, this idea of comparing our standard of living in the United States with what we were seeing around us. We really got to see a lot of that firsthand, and we were still making an hourly rate that was comparable to US standards when we were traveling. Then we were in all these countries where people are making like $1 a day or who knows, so much less than we were making. That really got stuck in our kids' minds. And now they have in their minds, this is what dad makes in a day, and then everything,
yeah,
everything else that they come across, well, whatever dad makes in a day, he could buy that by working a day or whatever. They think about that when they think about other people. So they have a much broader sense of standard of living and how much things cost and where we fall in terms of being super privileged and wealthy compared to the rest of the world.
And is there anything you would have done differently?
for what we knew then, no, I would have not have done anything differently for gap year. I think it was well balanced between staying in one place sometimes and then moving around. Got to see a lot. After that year, I guess I would ask ourselves another question, which is, would we do anything differently if we did a second gap year? The answer is definitely yes. One is that moving around countries is a real pain. Border crossings are a real pain. So I think I would probably tend toward going to less places and getting deeper into maybe just one or two places if we were to take another year. The other thing, which is kind of related to it, is I think we would be way more intentional about trying to put the kids in a situation where they could learn the language and they could make friends that they could keep for quite a while.
Would you consider moving abroad indefinitely? And if so, where?
We have always been thinking about doing that. We have not pulled the trigger yet, but I just recently had pangs of longing for Brazil and started looking at house prices there. And it's nothing I think we could do in the next year or so, but it's definitely something I think about.
And when we were in Colombia, because we had been to Colombia a couple other times previous to our family gap year, we actually started looking at land in Colombia, land and houses. The property values there were higher than we expected. It just didn't make sense to dive into something unknown at that point. We've been considering it, and probably Brazil was one of our top choices. We really liked Ecuador too.
Bolivia too,
Oh,
actually.
Bolivia was also, I mean, Bolivia has a great cost of living. So, yeah, those are all possibilities.
And for people thinking about taking a gap year to slow travel, how does one prepare? How far in advance do you need to start planning, and what should people think about, especially if they're traveling as a family with young children? What tips and hacks can you share?
I could probably fill a whole podcast with that question, but I'll try to keep it just to a few points. We started planning 3 years in advance. We were really ticking off items in earnest for the last year. And the things I would say you have to prepare for, I would put into like three categories. First is obviously financial. It kind of depends what your personality is like, but for me, not having the savings to make it through the year and then some to land on our feet when we get back, I don't think I would have enjoyed my time if I was having to worry about that. The second category is probably the biggest and takes the most time, which is how do you put your life on hold while you're gone? If you're a kid and you just have an apartment, like that's super easy. You don't have hardly anything to do there. But if you have a house, a life, a car, pets, all these things. How do you basically automate your life so that you're not worrying about it while you're on the other side of the world with half a Wi-Fi connection? One big one is mail. We started looking what came in over the last year and trying to like cancel certain things. If we could tell someone stop sending us this, we did. Any bills that we had been writing checks to, we put on auto pay. And then for everything else, we had to forward the mail to Liuan's mom. There's also services you can pay for to do that kind of thing. She would open it up and send us anything that looked important. See, we had a cat that we had to bring over to the neighbor to be fed. The biggest thing was the house because you can't just leave a house alone for a year. Pipes could burst. You could come home and the place is taken over by squirrels and raccoons. You need somebody looking at it and taking care of it and fixing things as they come up. What we actually did is we turned it into an Airbnb listing and found a friend willing to do the cleaning and management of it. The money we earned from that was actually just icing on the cake. The big thing was the fact that she was cutting the grass and taking care of issues that came up and keeping the place clean and all that. And then the final category is as you're leaving, you're probably heavily involved in stuff. I mean, at the very least, your work. And so just thinking about, I'm taking a gap year, I'm going to leave a gap wherever I'm leaving from, whether that be work or whatever. Like, how can I make things easy for the people I'm leaving? How do I not burn bridges in case I want to come back to my life, not have soured relationships in leaving and not preparing well?
I would add, especially related to traveling with young kids, and we kind of touched on this earlier, is thinking about the places you go in advance and doing your research on what will be there for my kids. Parenting is a full-time job. So if you think you're going to be able to take a vacation from that, that's not going to happen when you're traveling. A lot of the things we rely on for childcare at our home, school or the gym drop off or babysitters, we wouldn't have access to in other countries, especially being there short term. So kind of doing something in advance on how can we provide activities and structures and ways that our kids can get some time with adults other than us, just to keep everyone sane. And we love being around our kids, but you kind of start pulling your hair out when you've been on a long distance bus with them for 8 hours, and then you're in an Airbnb with them for nonstop for a while. And having ways to get out and kind of be part of local society has been important on all different kinds of travel experiences that we've been on.
Any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Anybody out there is thinking about doing this, there's probably just a ton of fears that are going to come up. Can I quit my job? Is that going to be a catastrophe? Are the kids going to get behind in school? Is something really bad going to happen? Is it going to be unsafe? I've heard this from a lot of people that have done this, and I can say for myself that it turns out fine. Things work out. You deal with things as they come up, and I can say for myself, if we ever get an opportunity to do this again, I would take it.
I just echo everything that Matt said.
Thanks for taking the time to chat today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
The American Citizens Abroad podcast is a monthly podcast that is published the second Tuesday of each month. It is edited and produced by me, Michelle, and is a product of American Citizens Abroad. You can email us at podcast@americansabroad.org. Remember, give us a good rating on Apple Podcasts so other Americans living abroad can find us. The content of ACA podcasts, including documents and presentations, is made available solely for general information purposes. It is not intended and should not be treated as legal, financial, or tax advice. The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the views of American Citizens Abroad, Inc., or any affiliated organization. ACA does not warrant the accuracy, completeness, or usefulness of any content or other information. ACA disclaims all liability and responsibility arising from any reliance placed on any content or information by you or any other person. ACA is nonpartisan and does not support any political party or candidate.